Hello, my name is Arnold Zack. I am a mediator and arbitrator of labor management disputes based in Boston. And I have for many years been teaching a course in designing dispute resolution at the Labor and Work-Life program at Harvard Law School. I am very much interested in the area of conflict resolution, not merely as a neutral, but primarily because I believe that is a very effective machinery for solving problems of the workplace in particular, but problems that through the workplace affect the society. The Boston Global Forum is to be commended for looking into this field, and I'm particularly entranced and enthused about the idea of taking leaders of a global issue and testing its applicability for local action. So think globally and act locally in the Boston, Massachusetts area. And that's where I think we as citizens can have a greater impact than we can by merely giving speeches and writing papers and watching memos of what's going on in the world. Let me bring this directly to the issue I want to talk about, and that is, what is so relevant for a mediator and arbitrator to talk about what's been going on in, say, Bangladesh or in the factories of the rest of the world? We all know what has happened to the departure of jobs from the United States, particularly in manufacturing. And we particularly feel it sensitively here in Massachusetts. I was born in the city of Lynn, and that's where the shoe industry used to be. And then the shoe industry moved to out to St. Louis. Then it moved overseas, and at current, it's in a city in Guangdong, where the 14 factories produce some 5 billion pairs of shoes a year. That's the majority of the world's shoes are made overseas. So what? We've lost jobs. That's awful. We should bring them back. That's imperative. But we have to look at what's happening in the rest of the world and the conditions that are facing these workers who are doing these unskilled jobs. If their conditions can be improved, that is an immediate goal. In the long run, if these countries develop standards that provide workplace safety and improve benefits for the workers, they in turn become almost less competitive. And that's one of the ways in which jobs can be returned to the United States when the cost of going overseas, the cost of transportation, the tariffs and so on become so heavy that it behooves employers to start thinking about manufacturing in the United States again. So there's a self-interest to the United States in this, as well as a humanitarian interest in making sure that things go well for workers in developing countries. It's very hard to police. There are no international laws that deal with this. There is no guarantee that the national laws of the countries where these factories exist are there for the benefit of the workers or are enforced. In too many countries, there's too much corruption by the employers who are by the government officials who are responsible for enforcing the laws, and the brands and the factories that are producing for the brands can turn their heads aside and say, it's not our problem. We have codes of conduct, and most companies do, saying these are the standards by which we expect factories which produce for us to treat their employees fairly and to provide decent workplace conditions and, in the case of Bangladesh, safe environmental conditions and safe factories and building sites. But it's their responsibility. It's the responsibility of the government, says a lot of these brands, and that we will try and monitor these things, but we can't really effectively police the rest of the world. And when you think of companies and brands like Gap and Disney products produce in more than 10 to 15,000 factories in over 50 countries around the world. The opportunity for monitoring that becomes very expensive, and the cost of doing so becomes prohibitive. And even if they try their best, they are still unscrupulous and unfair and greedy factory owners and factory subcontractors who see a fast buck by lowering their costs by taking it out of the hides of the workers, by having them work long hours without overtime, pay, to having them live in dormitories or more likely barracks, to cut down their time away for personal needs and to get the most they can out of these workers, often employing children and employing people at below legal standards, even in the countries in which they operate. Now, I've been involved in this primarily because of my interest in helping to develop dispute settlement machinery, which I've done for a number of countries and international organizations. And I have wondered all along as what the most effective way is approaching all this. And at the outset, I was entranced by the idea of the brands and their codes of conduct as the most effective way of spreading the good word. And these brands do try, and they are to be commended for that. But it is very difficult for them to police, to the extent that they hire monitors to police their factory or the subcontracting factories. There's never assurance that those monitors are going to give all the bad news to their bosses. There are certain basic international standards. I start off by saying there's no international law, but there are international standards. The International Labor Organization has on its books about 250 what are called conventions that are agreed to by managements, worker groups, and unions in all their member countries. And those are the international norms. They are the standards. They are the conventions. And among those are 8 international codes, conventions, which everyone agrees are the basic standards of fundamental fair play in the workplace. And they include freedom of association, the right of collective bargaining, gender equity, the protection against the employment of child workers, and the protection against slavery, uncompensated workers. And most countries have been signatory to those conventions, and most countries at least give lip service to complying with them. But the factory owners are not always so cooperative, and so they try to do what they can to enhance their profits, frequently violating these codes. And for the monitors who go in to survey what's happening, they are confronted with double sets of books. They are, and they, I can, as we can well imagine, they would have some difficulty reporting back to their brands that, oh, gee, you're not doing a good job because the Convention 87 and 98 say that you have to give the employees the right to freedom of association, the right to unionize. And a lot of companies don't want to do that in their overseas factories. Certainly the factory managers don't want to do that. Certainly the governments, many of which are corrupt in these host countries, don't want to do that or seek to repress the unions because they become the unions as the basic building block of democracy, as we can look back to Gdansk and Solidarity in Warsaw, which brought the fall of the Soviet Union. Trade unions are the building blocks of democracy. So a lot of companies, a lot of countries don't want to see trade unions or workers' organizations develop. And of course, the workers therefore lose a voice and lose any opportunity for representation to combat violations by their employers or violations by their countries and governments. So what I think has happened in Bangladesh is an awful situation with what happened in terms of the factory's destruction and in terms of the impact it's had on the workers. I have been working in neighboring country, Cambodia, where there has been for many years the ILO has been doing the monitoring and assuring fair workplace conditions. There is, after the Bangladesh disaster, an ILO effort to begin monitoring what's been going on in Cambodia, where the ILO does the monitoring and makes sure employees are treated fairly, where there's an arbitration council that deals with questions of whether or not the employers are acting honestly and whether or not there are violations of the government statutes and of international norms and of collective bargaining agreements. Cambodia has been successful in that, despite occasional strikes, which are indeed the mark of a democracy. And there is hope that it will spread to Bangladesh. But at present, it's difficult to identify who are the good guys in the management side in Cambodia, in Bangladesh. When the issue arose and the companies began to try to achieve some or demonstrate some support of what was going on. The European countries largely created the Accord, in which they committed themselves to be bound by external determinants of what is fair treatment of compensation for the people and families who are lost because of those fires and the deaths that ensued. Some companies followed an alliance in which was less responsive, in my estimation, by saying that we will set the cap and we will determine, not any independent government agency, how much liability our members are willing to pay up. So that is a first step. At least the Accord has done well. I applaud the Boston Global Forum in trying to identify the local brands, the local employers, the local factories, the local stores that are selling or making the products of these brands, because who are of the companies that are doing well and doing good. And I think that the idea of taking an international issue and applying it and recognizing those locally who are living up to standards of fair play and workplace fairness and not destroying the prospects of a fair society deserves some commendation. And I think the Boston Global Forum is on the right track. Thank you very much.